Hey, Hammy here, bringing you video number 3, 24.3, Organization and Diversity of Roots. So again, we're going through the roots, shoots, and leaves of the flowering plants. This video, we're going to focus on the roots, okay? Roots are usually located underground. And normally the root system equals the shoot system. So if you look at the tree over here, you can see everything that's underneath the ground is usually equal to kind of what's above the ground. So if you see a big maple tree or something like that, that big tree and all of this stuff, usually there's that much roots and stuff underneath the ground as well. The function of roots, usually to anchor in the soil, support the plant. Main one here, absorb water and minerals. They'll usually have these root hairs, this real fine root hairs to increase surface area for absorption. We'll learn in later chapters some of the plant hormones that affect how a plant grows and responds to the environment are produced in the roots. And sometimes they're used for storage of carbohydrates, what we would call tap roots. Our carrots, beets, and radishes are all obvious examples of like some storage roots. Oftentimes that storage is used for growth then later on the next spring if they're perennials. When we look at a root tip, there are usually 3 different zones that we find. Okay, so the zone, we're going to actually start down here at the bottom, the zone of cell division, okay, down here. Just like it sounds, cell division, that's where cells are dividing. When we did our mitosis chapter, we looked at slides of onion root tips. Why root tips? Because that's where they're pushing through the soil. It's where the apical meristem is. Remember, meristematic tissue is like the stem cells. They're actively growing. There is a root cap there kind of on the end because as this thing pushes through the soil, some of those cells will get sloughed off, and so we need to produce new cells to replace them. And the zone of cell division, those actively growing cells going through mitosis, are going to provide cells as the root gets longer, okay, the zones above them. Zone 2, elongation, just like it sounds, the cells mature. The cells kind of grow in a length, kind of those typical rectangular cells that we saw when we looked at the root tip. And they start to become specialized, whether they're epidermal cells, vascular cells, cortex. We'll look at some of those tissues on the next slide. And the zone of maturation, once you get up here to the top, zone number 3, the cells are fully differentiated and functioning in whatever they need to do in the root. First, we want to look at the dicot root, the eudicot root, and go through some of the 5 main tissues we find in a dicot root. First, on the outside, we have what we call the epidermis, just like we have an epidermis on the outside of us. It's usually a single layer. This is where we find the root hairs that extend out into the soil for water and mineral absorption. Right on the inside of the epidermis is the cortex. Cortex are parenchyma cells, oftentimes used for food storage. Okay, so the carbohydrates that are coming down from the leaf are stored here in the cortex. Inside of that is the endodermis. The endodermis regulates. So you see water and minerals. You see it 2 places here. Okay, water and minerals can actually come in between the cells and work their way in between the cortex. But when it gets to the endodermis, there's kind of a roadblock there. The endodermis keeps water that come in between the cells of the epidermis and the cortex from just going directly into the vascular cylinder. It has to go through the endodermis first, kind of like the protector or the guard wall. Okay, and the Casparian strip, which has lignin and suberin, kind of help make it waterproof, seal it up, and prevent the water and the ions from moving through. Another route water minerals can take is actually in a root hair into a cell and through the plasmodesmata, just going from cell to cell to cell into the endodermal cells. Okay, from there, they pass through the pericycle, okay, into the vascular cylinder. The vascular cylinder Inside of a dicot is usually star-shaped. Inside of that star are the xylem. Okay, remember, xylem is what's carrying the water and the minerals. So as the water moves in through these cells, through the endodermis, it'll move into the xylem and then up the plant. Okay, between the rays of the xylem, okay, right here and here, and here, and here, and here, and here, you find the phloem. Okay? And the phloem is what is going to be carrying the sugars and stuff back down to the root. A monocot root is set up a little bit differently, like we mentioned in our previous video, 2 videos ago. It has the same growth zones as the Dicot root. Okay, so the zone of division, the zone of maturation, elongation, and the zone of maturation. It has those same zones as they're growing, root cap and so forth. But when we do a cross section of the root, we notice that it's set up a little bit differently. There's not that star pattern inside. Okay, so you have on the outside, it still has the epidermis out here, and followed by the cortex, and then the endodermis with the Casparian strip. Okay, that's not that much different. Okay, and then the pericycle right inside of that. What we do notice is the vascular tissue is a little bit different. You'll notice that there is sort of this pith, okay, in the center. Okay, the pith, which would be right in the middle of the vascular bundle, and then you'll see alternating things of xylem and phloem. So the xylem, this would be kind of a branch or arm of xylem right here, sort of the bigger tubes like looking cells right here. And then in between there, you'll find little bundles of phloem stuck between the xylem. So again, when you just look at the cross section of the root in a monocot, it's a little bit different than the cross section of a eudicot. When we look at root diversity, they're not all the same. Usually, eudicots start with more of a taproot, more of this single downward push, whereas monocots usually start with more of a fibrous root system. These are good if you have bare soil or something we often plant. Remember, we said monocots tend to be a lot of the grasses. We plant them on bare banks and stuff to prevent soil erosion because those fibrous roots help hold it in place. Once you get to be an adult plant, usually it's a mix of both types. Roots can also have adaptations. For example, if you look at the potatoes over here, food storage, right? So a lot of the carbohydrates and starches that are made taken to the potato, which we then dig up and make into yummy, yummy French fries. Okay, but food storage, and then later on, again, if you know how potatoes work, those will sprout and form the plants then the next year. Corn, which is very tall and kind of top heavy, above the ground will have these little prop roots that just help anchor the plant, keep them from blowing over. Plants that live in very wet environments, the nematophores, like mangrove trees and mangrove swamps, the root tissues need to go through cellular respiration, okay, for energy, right? So they need oxygen. So they have to have gas exchange. Remember, we talked about stems and branches having lenticels in the last video. So how do roots get gases if they're underwater? So they will actually have pneumatophores, which are these little branching roots that look like prop roots, but they're not really propping. They're just up in the air out of the water, just being used for gas exchange. And finally, this idea of epiphytes. Epiphytes are plants that grow up onto other plants. So they have modified roots for, like in the jungles and so forth, for actually getting water vapor out of the air because their roots are actually not touching the ground. Some have haustoria, which are little, might actually kind of tap into the host plant that they're on to get nutrients and water and mineral from the host plant. So epiphytes often have modified roots because they are up in the air on some type of host plant or pole or something like that. So they have specialized roots for getting their water and minerals because they're not stuck in the soil. And finally, we want to talk about some root symbiotic relationships. Remember, symbiosis is where, in this case, both organisms are benefiting. A lot of it, a lot of organisms have what we call mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae is a association between the root tissues of the plant and also a fungus, and it's going to greatly increase surface area for absorption. So again, if you compare these two grasses down here with mycorrhizae, you can see all the fine filaments and stuff, and here's without mycorrhizae. Um, and so there is a big difference. There are some species of orchids and stuff, for example, that will not grow if there is not the proper fungus around them for their roots. The other big one is legumes, especially the farmer in me. We deal with legumes all the time. Legumes have these little root nodules, and here you can see on the plant these little bubbles or nodules that are underground that contain nitrogen fixing bacteria. So remember back to Bio 2, we talked about the nitrogen cycle. Plants need nitrogen. It's one of the limiting factors, but they can't use the nitrogen in the air. So these nitrogen fixing bacteria take an N2 out of the air, okay, and fix it or attach it to and make it ammonia and eventually nitrites, and then eventually nitrifying bacteria change it to nitrates, okay, which the plant can use. Examples of legumes: soybeans, peanuts, peas, beans, dried, chickpeas, lentils, a lot of food products. On the farm, we rotate our very nitrogen dependent corn and wheat with legumes like soybeans and also alfalfa, which we use for hay for our animals. Alfalfa is a legume as well that help replace the nitrogen that the other crops have taken out of the ground, and it just makes it good. It helps with disease and that kind of stuff as well. So two big root symbiotic relationships are mycorrhizae and also the root nodules with the nitrogen fixing bacteria. And that's it for roots.